Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm calling today's episode, The UFO Entities, 10 True Extraterrestrial Encounters. I think it's important to remember that there are entities, humanoids, people inside of these craft, that we are being visited. And it's important to note that you can easily dismiss one case, even 10 or 20 or 100, but there are thousands upon thousands of these cases. Skeptics really don't have a leg to stand on anymore. There's far too much evidence, far too many cases to deny the fact that we are being visited. That's why I like doing this research. I think there's a lot we can learn from these cases, and it is the humanoid cases that really lie at the very heart of the UFO phenomenon. I've chosen 10 cases coming from all over the world, including Australia, Brazil, Canada, England, France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and 2 from the United States, including Ohio and Virginia. And I've got cases reaching pretty far back in time to the 1940s all the way up to the 2010s. So there are some of you out there who've asked me to cover some more recent cases, and you will find a few of them here. I like doing these chronologies because they prove a couple of important points. One, that this has been going on for a very long time. Another, that this is occurring all over the world. And another is that these reports are remarkably consistent, regardless of when they occurred or where. A wide variety of humanoids here. We've got short little humanoids. We've got very tall ones, human-looking, grays, light beings, I mean, you name it. All different types of entities. And, of course, all kinds of evidence. So again, each of these cases do have remarkable commonalities, but many of them have some unique details too, and all of them provide profound insights into what's going on here. So let's just get started. And the first case I call UFO landing during World War II. I think this is an important case not only because it occurred quite early in the summer of 1944 in Verger, France, but also it occurred at a time when this country was being torn apart by war. That alone is quite unusual. It is a single witness case, but it was professionally researched by experienced investigators. So I think it's got something to offer to our understanding of what's going on here. This case first appeared in the June 1972 issue of the French publication Lumière dans la Nuit. It was written by the witness herself, a lady by the name of Mademoiselle Madeleine Arnoux. At the time of her encounter, she was 13 years old. And at this time, every week, she would travel by bicycle to a farm near Verger, not far from her home in Toulon-sur-Eure, to get food. This was during wartime again, and it was on this hot, overcast summer day in 1942 that she was bicycling from her home to this farm along Road 42. And nearing her destination, she stopped, got off her bike to walk down a small dirt road into the woods where she knew of some berry bushes that she could pick from. So as she's heading down this path, this little dirt road, she looked up, and about 300 feet in front of her, right before a curve in the road, sitting in the middle of the road, was a small, dull, metallic gray, dome-shaped object. She said it was quite small, about the size of a small car, smooth, featureless, no markings, no portholes, no doors, but standing next to it were 3 or more small humanoid figures. And as Madeleine says, the beings who stood nearby must have been less than 1 meter high, and were dressed in some sort of brown-colored jumpsuits. They made no gestures in my direction, and for my part, I was frozen in place. Suddenly I was able to react, and wanted to take back my bike, which was lying a few meters away. The time it took me to bend down, and when I raised my head to look again at the strange apparition, there was nothing left. Only at this point, the trees were shaken by a strong wind. I did not think to look up, where I probably still would have been able to see the flying machine. So yeah, she thinks the strong wind was coming from this craft taking off. And again, World War II was still taking place. France was invaded at this time. She was familiar with tanks and planes and all of this, but as she is certain that the strange figures and the vehicles she saw had nothing to do with any of this. And in fact, the whole experience left a profound impression on her. As she says, I was terrified, and I hurried back to the farm where, of course, I did not talk about anything. I did not talk about it any more at home when I got back, because I suspected that I would be called a liar and a fabulist. I thought about the strange encounter for a long time, and then I forgot about it. It was not until people started talking about flying saucers that I made the connection and thought that I had probably seen one of those mysterious UFOs there. After so many years, the image is still very clear in my memory, and I know very well that I did not dream it, and that what I saw in the woods that day was nothing known. There were many resistance fighters in the region, but it couldn't have been any of them. No more than German soldiers, and no doubt one or the other would have called out to me. So I must assume that what I witnessed was one of the first UFO visits there. And I can assure you that for a young 13-year-old girl, these facts were quite exceptional, quite surprising, quite fantastic, so that I still remember it very well. Now it's also important to note that Madeleine says only a few years earlier, she and many other people in the area did view a motionless object gleaming in the night sky. And this went on for several nights in a row. There was all kinds of speculation about what it might be, balloons or zeppelins, but that failed to account for the strange appearance of this object and disappearance, because one day it just stopped appearing. Really interesting is that this was seen directly above where Madeleine had seen this landed object. Yes, that is a single witness case, and yes, the witness was a teenager, but I think old enough to recognize the difference between a tank or a plane or any other normal vehicle, because some skeptics have brought up, well, she's just a little girl, maybe she didn't realize what she was seeing. But, as you can tell from her testimony, she was very deeply impressed by what she saw and still talks about it decades later. It's an important case, I think. And now let's move to another one. And of all the cases in this compilation, I have to tell you this one is probably the most famous. It did get a lot of publicity at the time it occurred. It's still being talked about today. I call this one, They Were Different From Us. This is a direct quote from one of the witnesses. It's a multiple witness case. Actually 3 witnesses, if you want to be technical about it. This one occurred on October 25, 1954 in Apignano, Italy. This is during the middle of an intense wave, mostly in France, but certainly in the surrounding areas as well. And I like this case because the humanoid is one type that I don't think I've ever heard before in terms of its description. It was a cold day, October 25, 1954, in the area where this encounter occurred, Apignano, Italy, as 2 12-year-old boys, Marciano Giampieri and his friend Pacifico Tantucci, were grazing their family's sheep after school. So they, after doing this, returned home to get something to eat. It was around 5 p.m. that they went back to mind the sheep. And coming up to the flock, they noticed that the sheep had moved some distance away from their original location. So they began to round the sheep up, and then they lit a fire to warm themselves. And this is when their dog, Fido, began to bark insistently and seemed to be looking at one certain spot. So they went to investigate, and they got a tremendous shock. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. As Marciano says, "We decided to head to that spot. And once we were there, we were breathless. We stumbled across 3 small beings, about 35 centimeters tall, together, close to a kind of barrel. The 3 beings wore a silver suit that enveloped them completely. They were different from us. They had a very large head compared to the rest of the body, and besides that, instead of round, it was very flat." So Marciano got a much better look than his friend as he was closer. He said that the suits that they wore were dark and shiny and looked almost plastic in texture. And this barrel-like object he's describing was apparently a craft, only about 70 centimeters wide and 1.5 meters long, or 2¼ feet wide, 4½ feet long. It had what looked like short little antennae or projections of some kind coming out of one end. And again, these figures were less than 2 feet tall, very tiny. 3 of them, and almost immediately these 3 little figures, apparently frightened by the sudden appearance of the 2 boys, fled back into their cylindrical-shaped craft. The craft then made a hissing noise. It rose upwards about 20 meters or 60 feet. The little antenna on the back began to vibrate, and then it let out this large fireball, and the craft darted away at fantastic speed, the boys said, to the east. And this fireball that it emitted came down and exploded just before reaching the ground. It made a loud banging sound. It emitted a strong gust of wind which struck both the boys. Now, not too far away was an older woman, Maria Ruggieri, and she was working in the fields, and she saw this craft also. She saw it go up and depart. She described it as an object surrounded by many lights, flying upwards and then disappearing. So Maurizio and Pacifico ran straight home and told their parents, who absolutely believed them because they could see how emotional the boys were. And they reported it to the police, and soon their case attracted all kinds of attention. It actually became national news. As Maurizio says, the carabinieri, that's the police, the carabinieri came and questioned us for several days to understand what had really happened, while the national press provided a lot of coverage of the story. Of course, our tender age and the nature of told facts have kept our story not officially believed. They threatened us to run lie detector tests. I was targeted by everyone, journalists, carabinieri, and even then the parish priest, Don Quinto, who made me swear on the gospel that what I was saying was really true. Not only that, as if Pacifico and I were criminals, we were interrogated separately by the carabinieri. Despite the pressure and fear, we always confirm our story and what we had seen. So yeah, following this encounter, the boys were visited by many researchers, and even 60 years later, Maurizio found himself being interviewed about his amazing childhood encounter with a landed UFO and humanoids. An undeniably very unusual and interesting case. And again, multiple witnesses. It's amazing to me how profoundly these experiences affect people. Because here we are some 60 years later, and this witness is still talking about this case and how deeply it affected him. He's sticking to his guns, as do most witnesses. So yeah, another amazing example of a UFO landing and humanoids getting out. This is happening all over the world, because here's another case which occurred in the United States. I like this case, it's quite profound. Yes, the witness is a young child, and it's primarily a single witness case, though apparently it does have landing traces, and possibly another witness. It's not completely verified, but the case was professionally investigated by a very respected researcher. I call this one, They Were Holding Hands. It occurred on August 10, 1962, in a rural area of Vienna, Virginia. I think you'll find this case quite interesting. This amazing case was investigated by MUFON field investigator Norm Gagnon and was written up in the August 2015 issue of the MUFON UFO Journal. The main witness is known only as Jay. He's anonymous. At the time of his encounter, he was either 7 or 8 years old. His family had just moved into a new house in the fairly small town of Vienna, Virginia. They had just moved in. Jay hadn't even explored the backyard yet. He and his 2 brothers were sharing a bedroom. He had his own bed, while his brothers slept in a bunk bed. But Jay's bed was right next to a window which overlooked the backyard. And when it was August 10, 1962 or so, everyone in this house was asleep when, as Jay says, quote, "something made me wake up." So he opened his eyes and saw that his room was filled with bright light. The whole room was illuminated, and Jay felt strangely compelled to look out the window. As he says, For whatever reason, I had to look out the window. To this day, I wonder why I looked out the window. But it's good that he did, because he saw something so extraordinary, so unusual, that it would remain etched into his memory for the rest of his life. As Jay says, the whole area was a very bright white. It was like in the middle of the day brightness. There were 3 what looked to be people in my backyard. These entities reminded me of a family. There were 2 tall ones, I'm guessing maybe 4 feet tall, and a smaller one. The smaller one was in the middle, and I'm pretty sure that the 2 tall ones were holding hands with the smaller one. I know they were looking at me. I don't recall seeing their noses, necks, any hair, or even mouths. It is like their heads just blended into the body. They were grayish white, no clothes, and nothing to reveal if they were male or female. Just all grayish whiteness except for their eyes, which were very dark and almond-shaped. Now again, this was the first time Jay had even seen the backyard. It was, as he says, all lit up like daylight. Now looking towards his neighbor's house, he did see this 15-foot-tall antenna tower. He would later learn that his neighbor was an amateur radio operator, and the beings were standing just to the left of the antenna tower, and right next to this tower was a, quote, saucer shape, which Jay describes as gray and so bright that it was hard to look at. This could be an important detail that it's landing next to a radio antenna tower, because we do see this sort of interest in technology. So perhaps that's why they were there. But as Jay says regarding this craft, it appeared to be a grayish, silver, circular object with a dome on top, like a classic flying saucer that is portrayed in films, but it didn't have any doors or windows. He said this object was quite small, that was his impression, maybe 4 feet in diameter, he guesses, and it seemed to be hovering a few feet above the ground. But he really only glanced at it and was far more interested in these 3 little figures. And as Jay says, as weird as it sounds, I felt like something was telling me it was okay and not to be scared. And I wasn't scared. And looking back, it was very peaceful. They just continued to stare at me. I felt very safe, and like they were friends. It was a feeling and knowledge from within that I have a hard time explaining. It was hard not to continue looking at the 3 of them. I felt very at ease and safe. So Jay did notice that the whole backyard was illuminated by a very bright light source, apparently coming from above. As he says, there was a very bright white light, or something lighting everything up. A light shining down from above, it seemed. I don't really know where all the bright light was coming from. So it could have been that there was another object above, but he didn't see it. And for reasons that elude Jay, he dropped back down into bed and immediately fell right back to sleep. Why he did this, instead of continuing to watch the little gray men, continues to puzzle him to this day. He's not even sure he actually recalls going back to bed. He was just suddenly asleep and morning arrived. And it was a short time after this incident that he went out into the backyard, and he of course recognized all the features of it from having seen it all lit up on that previous night. And as Jay says, the most amazing thing about it is there was an indentation in the ground, round in shape, where I saw this grayish saucer thing. So he kept secret about the entire event, but later did tell his family and a few close friends. And when he did, one of Jay's brothers said that he remembered that night. This surprised Jay, because he did not remember his brother being awake, but he does admit that he could have been because he didn't actually check, so it's possible. At the time of this encounter, Jay had never heard of gray aliens, and it wasn't until decades later, when he saw the image of grays appearing in popular media, that he was surprised to see that they matched, quote, exactly what I saw. And as he says, I find this incident really weird and strange as years go by. I know what I saw. It's amazing and baffling at the same time. So it really impressed him deeply, and as he says, I call them friends. I remember being at peace and feeling like they were friends. That's the only way I can describe it. It was a strong feeling and still is. Such a cool case. I think it is quite possible there's more to it than the witness remembers, given that he doesn't fully remember getting back into bed. But I love this case because it shows a really human aspect to these ETs, with what looks like a mom and dad, Gray, holding the hands of their little child. And it's also interesting to me because the witness felt very strongly bonded to these ETs as if they were his friends. This is something I do hear quite a lot when I interview people, so it doesn't surprise me, but I think it's an important detail. So, a real interesting case. And here is another one that I find quite compelling. I call this one The Aliens in the Cornfield. This one is another single witness case, but certainly very interesting in its details. This one occurred on July 19, 1967 in São Benedito do Sul. This is in Brazil. And boy, this lady got a very, very close-up look at this UFO and two entities who have a very interesting appearance, a very interesting description she gives of them. This very profound case comes from researcher Enoch Burgos and was published in the SBDEV Bulletin. This is a very popular Brazilian UFO publication. And it was around 9:30 p.m., again on July 19, 1967, as 18-year-old Maria de Figueiredo and her two young brothers, age 8 and 10, were collecting ears of corn in their father's cornfield in São Benedito do Sul. Again, this is in Pernambuco, Brazil. Their dog was also with them, and they were using extra care as they explored this field to avoid encountering any poisonous snakes, which were known to be in the area. So Maria's two younger brothers moved off, and she found herself alone, and this was when she was suddenly overwhelmed by a strong gust of wind, which was strong enough to rustle the corn stalks all around her, and at the same time, she heard a soft cracking sound behind her. So she whirled around and was amazed to see a little 3-foot tall humanoid standing very close, less than 10 feet away from her. She said this figure looked entirely human. It had an oval-shaped head, thin hair styled in a bowl cut, and a neatly trimmed mustache. He was wearing dark trousers, a belt, a shirt with a kind of vest. He wore what looked to her like a necklace around his neck with a strange medallion that had strange, indecipherable symbols on it. Now, directly behind this 3-foot tall humanoid was a small, strange craft, 6 feet long about, 3 feet high. It had a dark metallic base with what looked like a cross or almost a propeller-looking thing on the front of it, and on top of it was a large, rounded, transparent, glass-like dome. This craft was hovering at an angle just above the ground, about 3 feet up, and inside this transparent dome, Maria could see another small humanoid, pretty much identical to the first, but he was only visible from the shoulders upwards. Now at this point, Maria wanted to shout out for her brothers and flee the area, but found that she was immobilized, and she watched with astonishment as this little man walked to the front of the cornfield, picked up an ear of corn, and began to closely examine it. He then looked directly at Maria and gestured to her. Now, this being did not say anything, but Maria did have the impression that the humanoid was asking her if the corn was edible. It then looked to her like the humanoid was saying something to his companion, who was still inside the craft. So for the next few moments, this little guy continued to explore the cornfield, then at one point nodded to the other humanoid in the craft. The humanoid inside the craft waved to his companion in the field, at which point the little man in the field promptly returned into the craft. It was at this point that the family dog began to bark and jump up towards this hovering object, which quickly rose straight up, actually hitting the top branches of some nearby trees. And as Maria says, that's when I got really scared and I fainted. The next thing Maria knows, she's waking up to see her two brothers leaning over her, calling her name. She looked around. There was no trace of the two humanoids or their little craft. But following this encounter, she was interviewed at length by a lot of people, doctors, authorities, and university professors, and she reported her experience to them in great detail and with obvious sincerity. I like that case because here we have a witness who's really never heard of UFOs before, and yet describes what she saw in such great detail and with such obvious sincerity that it's really hard not to take her report seriously. It's also very interesting because the entities she reported look pretty much human, except they're quite small. But to have this 4-foot tall, 3-foot tall little guy with a mustache, I mean, it's just interesting to me, the variation that we have of all these humanoids. They're all basically human, I think, with just different ancestries. That is what the evidence is really beginning to show us. I think that's becoming increasingly clear. And here is another case, very unusual. I call this one, "There is someone in the house." This is a quote from one of the witnesses. It involves a married couple who had a very close encounter with an entity in their bedroom. This is important because this is one of the most common places people actually do see humanoids and extraterrestrials. You wouldn't think so, but yeah, bedroom encounters are really quite common. This one occurred in June of 1973 in Alma, Quebec, Canada. 1973 was a big year for humanoids, but this case also has some really interesting and unique details to it. This next case comes from Canadian researcher Christian Lemay and was published in the UFO magazine UFO Quebec. It was around 3:20 a.m. early one morning in June of 1973 when Louise Godet woke up in the bedroom of her home in Alma, Quebec, because she heard this strange, soft sound, similar, she said, to the purring of an engine of some kind. So she sat up in bed and was shocked to see this weird greenish mist enter through the window of her bedroom and settle down near the doorway. So she's peering at it, looking more closely, and this is when she could discern a strange humanoid form. She saw it quite distinctly. It was 4 feet tall. It appeared to be wearing a diving suit, silver, covering its entire body, complete with helmet and a dark faceplate. She could not see any facial features. But this figure, was about 4 feet tall and was floating just above the floor. So Louise immediately shoved her husband, Georges, waking him up, and shouted out, "Georges, there is someone in the house." So Georges looked, and he immediately noticed this strange bluish light, but he did not see any figure. He got up, searched the house for any sign of an intruder, but found nothing. He returned to the bedroom and told Louise that she must be dreaming. He told her, "You're sleeping," thinking that perhaps she was in the middle of an attack of sleepwalking or something like this, which was something she had never experienced before. So he's shouting at her, "Wake up." And she looked at him and said, "I am not sleeping. There's someone in the house and he's behind the door." Still, Georges could not see any figure. But following this, he did notice that his wife was acting quite strangely, almost as if she was entranced or under hypnosis or something. Eventually, they did go back to sleep, both of them, but as Georges said, he kept one eye open. It didn't help, because about a half hour later, Louise woke up again and saw this same figure. Again, she woke up her husband and shouted out, "George, there is someone in the bedroom." So he asked, "Where?" And Louise said, "He's behind the door," and explained again that it was this strange humanoid figure. George himself now began to feel some fear and concern, so he again got up, inspected the area around the bedroom door where Louise was seeing this figure, but couldn't see anything. And he wondered again if his wife was sleepwalking or something. And he said, "Look, you can well see that there is nobody." And she said, "No, he's there behind the door. I see him." And George asked her, "Well, what does he look like?" And Louise explained this figure again in detail. It was very short, was dressed in a tight-fitting aluminum outfit, and she told Georges, It's looking at you. It looks like it's trying to tell you something." So in order to reassure her, George turned on all the lights in the house, tried to joke with her, and sat up with her in bed trying to calm her down. And finally, after a short while, this humanoid had disappeared and they both went back to bed. And the rest of the night passed without any unusual events. However, events weren't quite over yet, because the next week Louise began to suffer from some pretty severe headaches, and she also began to dream about extraterrestrials. She said these were not nightmares. She says that in the dreams she found herself in the presence of several humanoids who looked just like the one she had seen twice in her home. And in these dreams, she was explaining to these ETs how humans live here on Earth. That is a very unusual case, and it's hard to reconcile why the wife could see this entity and the husband couldn't. I find that very unusual, but not unique. It's also really interesting because this case involves obviously deeper levels of contact, with the wife having some communication following this encounter, which again is not unusual. A real close encounter with a humanoid sometimes precedes more contact. And that's, I think, what we're seeing here. So in that regard, it's a real important case. Now let's move to another one, which occurred in England. And this one is a really fascinating case on multiple levels. I call this one, "I Felt Transfixed with Fear." Again, a single witness case, but it does have landing traces. It's got some very interesting elements to it. It occurred one morning in February of 1979 in Easingwold. This is in York in the UK. And the witness is a really stand-up guy. I think he's obviously very sincere in his testimony. But what I find so interesting about this encounter is that following it, he pretty much forgot about it. It was a very cool, crisp February morning in 1979 in Easingwold. This is near York in England, as Phil Shepherdson was driving his scooter, his motorbike, along a curving country lane. He had just passed Crake Village and was heading towards Hubie, where he worked as a chemical technician. And this is when he noticed something to his left, something that would change his life forever. I'll just let Philip describe in his own words, as he says, "I looked to my left, and my head flipped at what I saw. Hovering in a corner of a small field was a black, triangular-shaped object. What I saw just blew my mind. It was hovering in the field in total silence. I stopped to get a better look, not believing what I was seeing. At the top of this object was a cockpit of some kind, and there was a figure inside it. All I could see was a black helmet and some sort of black overall. It began to turn and look in my direction, turned to gaze at me. I was transfixed with fear. At the side of the craft were two figures, which appeared also to stop what they were doing and look in my direction. They were slim-looking figures, who too wore black overalls, and they were trying to push the vehicle into the next field, perhaps to conceal it amongst the standing grove. And for some moments I was just spellbound. I was shaking. The silence was stifling as we gazed at each other, and I felt some sort of contact taking place, but I just don't know what that was. I just had an intense feeling of some connection. I could not move. I could not think. I was rooted to the spot. Time seemed to stop. So Philip is not really sure how long this face-off lasted. He did get off his motorbike and was standing next to it at the time he saw this. The road was otherwise deserted. He did see that the figure in the craft was looking directly at him through this small round porthole. He also noticed that its helmet had 3 spikes on top, but his mind was completely overwhelmed by what he was seeing and the strangeness of it. He recalled that the figures by the craft had been crouched down when he first saw them, and appeared to be doing something to the craft, but then stood up and looked directly at him when he approached. He said they were slender in form and tall. And as Philip says, What struck me at the time was that this was a nuts and bolts technology, not fuzzy lights with a smudgy image. I freaked at the fact that an aircraft floating like a silent kite, with not a blade of grass out of place, and without jets, was way beyond our technology. Then it flew off at tremendous speed. Suddenly, my mind did not accept it anymore, couldn't take it anymore, and I got on my bike and took off to work. I don't remember getting there. In fact, everything after that seemed surreal. I appeared to forget the experience, as if told that this was something I shouldn't have witnessed. I just forgot it. I did not want to believe it. So, fearing ridicule, Philip told nobody. He actually just drove it out of his mind. He does remember arriving to work a little later than normal, but ultimately he blocked the whole experience out of his mind, and for over a decade he didn't think about it at all. But then, one evening, he began to experience these nightmares about this incident, and this is when he slowly recalled the entire experience. All these details came back to him as these dreams continued. And finally he decided it was time to come forward and share what happened to him. And he ended up co-founding a UFO group, the Yorkshire UFO Group, and he came forward, he says, in hopes that someone else saw what he did or something like it, and that they have been too scared to come forward, but now maybe he could encourage them to do so. His account has since been published in the UK UFO publication Northern UFO News and in the Yorkshire Evening Press newspaper and in other UFO publications. I think in most respects that's a pretty typical encounter in terms of a UFO landing and seeing humanoids. But I find it very interesting that the witness did report some very strong telepathic communication, sort of bond with these ETs, that he felt as if they were very friendly, almost like friends. We keep hearing this over and over again. I think it's an important detail. Also really compelling is the fact that this entire encounter kind of just left his mind for years and came back later. I'm really glad he stepped forward to talk about this. Most people don't. They are scared away by all the ridicule and disbelief and fear surrounding this subject. So kudos to all these witnesses who do have the courage to step forward, go public, and in some cases, as in this one, use their real names. So yeah, thank you very much to the witness for doing this. Because it's important. A lot of people are having these encounters. Far more, I think, than the general public realizes, and probably far more even than people within the UFO community realize. I don't think it's nearly as rare as a lot of people believe. All right, here is another case. I found this one super interesting because it's got some really unusual and unique elements to it. I call this one ET Surveillance. This one occurred on September 25, 1983 in Playa de Salgueiros. This is in Portugal. This is a really interesting case because it's quite long-lasting. The humanoids are really interesting because they're quite tall, but apparently looked human. But yeah, as we'll see, it's got some really unusual details to it. This case was investigated by two researchers, Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos and Juan A. Fernandez Perry, and was published in their Spanish-language book, Encyclopedia of Close Encounters with UFOs. The two witnesses in this case are anonymous, but we do have their initials. One is JFM, he's a 25-year-old agronomist, and then there's his girlfriend, age 26, known by the initials MFBR. They were camping in the woods not too far from Playa de Salgueiros. This is a beach area. It was around 1:30 a.m. on September 25, 1983, that both were awakened in their tent by a low-frequency motor sound. So the girlfriend, M, went back to sleep, but J stayed awake. And after about 20 minutes, he stepped out of the tent, and looking up, he saw a bright, rotating orange light about 1 kilometer away, hovering over the fields surrounding the beach. It was bright enough, he said, to illuminate a large portion of the field, and it was pulsating at 3-second intervals. It was very low, at the same level of their tent, so apparently at ground level. It was at this point that Jay noticed 2 additional objects on either side of this light, and he could now see that they were actually craft, 3 total, each supported by 3 pillar-like landing legs, which were touching the ground. These objects were kind of boat-shaped, they looked identical, and he estimates that they were about 6 meters in diameter, 18 feet. And this is when he noticed 4 humanoid figures standing next to this central object. They were essentially human-looking, normal stature and height, but all were wearing a white coverall which covered their bodies completely. 3 appeared to be men and 1 looked female, that was Jay's impression, and they were all standing together, clearly illuminated by the glow coming from these objects. Now it was not long after he noticed these figures that they each began to move in, quote, slow motion, walking very slowly and deliberately away from the object in different directions. They moved about 15 feet away, kind of symmetrically, with their heads down as if surveilling the terrain. After a few minutes, they returned and stood again together by this central object. At this point, the 2 objects on either side took off at an angle towards the southwest, but quickly returned and landed again. As Jay looked, he saw that the 4 humanoid forms were no longer visible. But 20 minutes later, all 3 craft took off, flew slowly over the area, then returned, landed again at the original position, and then took off very fast towards the northwest. So they appeared to be doing something in this area. Jay returned to his tent, and it was 10 minutes later that both he and his girlfriend woke up again because they heard more noises outside. And going outside and looking up, they saw the same 3 craft had landed once again in the same exact location. As soon as they saw them, however, these craft rose up, flew about 30 feet above the ground north along the coastline, performed a few more maneuvers, and were gone. Yet another example of a UFO, an ET craft coming down, landing, ETs coming out, and doing whatever it is they're doing. It's clear in this case they were very interested in this area. Couldn't find anything particularly unusual about this area. And I've said it before, I think if you name any city or town, you can probably find an encounter there. So it's clear that they're visiting all over the world. Because here's another case which occurs in the far-flung area, for me at least, here in the United States, all the way in Australia. I call this one a humanoid behind each window. This one occurred on December 31st, 1997, a fairly recent case. This is in Kenwick, Western Australia. There is some interesting things about Kenwick. This is an area where there is a nature preserve, so that could be a factor here. We do see a lot of cases of UFOs in very natural areas, studying wildlife. Perhaps that's what was going on here. I also like this case because there are multiple witnesses. It's a fairly long-lasting case, and the description of the humanoids is also very interesting. So this case took place again in Kenwick in Western Australia. It's mostly a rural suburb of about 5,000 to 6,000 people located on the outskirts of Perth, but it does have large areas of pristine wetlands and lots of agricultural property. This case was published first in the UFOrum Journal. Again, occurred on December 31st, 1997, when 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls, ranging in age from 7 to 13, decided to go camping on the family's property in this area. Now, it was around 10:30 p.m. when the primary witness, Ryan, he was the first to notice flashes of red light streaking down from the sky and back up from the ground. He estimates about 2 kilometers to the northeast, just over a mile. And after watching the activity for some time and seeing how strange it was, Ryan decided to call it to the attention of the other children, all of who were in the tent. So some of the children came out of the tent and watched this activity for about 30 minutes, but became bored apparently and returned back into the tent. But Ryan was still curious and remained outside to watch these lights. And this is when he was astonished to see a huge illuminated object coming directly towards him from the direction of these lights. So Ryan immediately called for the other kids to come back outside of the tent and take a look. 5 of the 8 children came out, and each saw the UFO moving towards them overhead, except for the last few who by the time they came out saw that the UFO was already directly above them. All the children could now hear a swooshing sound as this craft began to maneuver in the sky above them. All of them described it as being very large. Its exact shape wasn't clear, but underneath it they could all see in the center of the bottom of this object 3 brilliant yellow lights in a triangular formation, and around this triangle was a circle of much smaller lights, multicolored, blue, yellow, red, and white. This object did appear to be metallic, as they could see 3 bright silver-looking sort of landing pods. Now, Ryan did tell researchers that he saw something else very interesting, a row of large yellow windows in the center part, a long strip of windows above one row and another below it. But behind each window in the central section, Ryan could see separate humanoid figures, one in each window. So these figures had no hair, large eyes, thin arms and legs, and looked like a potbelly, no apparent clothing. And behind each of these figures he also saw what looked to him like some kinds of controls or technology of some kind. So these sound like typical grays. And according to Ryan, this object moved until it was directly overhead, at which point it stopped for a few seconds. And at this point it was close enough that they could see a white mist or vapor swirling around the landing gear and the lights. The object then moved off and disappeared from sight and was gone. A very interesting case by any standards. I think it's a really good example of UFOs putting on a display. Because not only did this UFO fly overhead, it came directly over this group of children. So it's clear to me that it wanted to be seen, that it was showing off, essentially, announcing its presence. I do believe this is one of the missions ETs have, a sort of really vigorous grassroots publicity campaign announcing their presence, probably because our own governments refuse to be truthful and transparent and talk with any honesty about this subject. Such a shame. We could be far more along in terms of progress with our relationship with ETs if our own governments would just be honest about this subject. Alas, I don't see that happening anytime soon. All right, let's move to the next case. This one is so interesting. Think of all the cases in this compilation today. This one to me is the most fascinating. And I was initially going to present one single incident, but it turned out that there were others surrounding this one encounter that I think are connected to it. So this is really a series of events I'll be covering here. I call this case the Purple Light Being. Very unusual encounter in terms of the description of the humanoid. This one occurred on December 21st, 2004 in Chillicothe, Ohio. And yeah, a series of events surrounding it, so there's some pretty good corroboration of this event. And it's also a multiple witness encounter. It was throughout 2003 and 2004 that quite a few UFO events occurred in Chillicothe, Ohio and the surrounding areas. For example, on October 18, 2003, Lonnie Kaplinger and his son Bruce were attending a football game when they saw strange glowing objects in the sky. As Bruce told reporters, "I couldn't believe it. It was too weird." He said he saw 2 bright lights moving towards them from above, and then, as he says, all of a sudden a third one appeared, then a fourth one. They were in a horizontal line, 4 bright lights. Then they slowly turned orange and just disappeared. It just makes you wonder what's out there. So yes, a simple sighting, but it was just a few days later, on October 21st, 2003, that another father and son duo were driving along US 23 between Chillicothe and Waverly, again in Ohio, when, as the father says, my son and I witnessed a brilliant green light that appeared in the sky and dropped from northwest to southeast before extinguishing. Immediately after it went out, the same event occurred, which made this very unusual. So again, a simple sighting, but yeah, unusual, doesn't sound like a shooting star or anything that's easily explained. And events were still in progress, because it was 1 month and 1 week later, at 10 p.m. on November 18, 2003, that a married couple were in their Chillicothe home when a UFO appeared outside. The husband saw it first. As the wife says, my husband came in and told me that there was a strange object in the sky. My husband, I, and the neighbor went out to watch it. The object started out as being triangular. We looked with binoculars, and it appeared to be changing colors. It had red, green, and blue lights, was glowing a white color also, would shine a beam of light, and then it would stop. As we watched, it would change shape. At one point, it appeared to divide in half. So they watched it for a good long time, almost 3 hours. They did try to take pictures, but the pictures did not come out. And after it disappeared, they went back into the house and found out something else unusual had happened. As the wife says, we had a strange message on our answering machine, which was sounds like echoes. My computer would not work also. The neighbor called complaining her computer would not work also. So she called the police, who said that they had not received any calls, but later asking around, she learned that others had seen this object and had also called the police. But events ramped up a short time later. It was 6 months later when a man in Circleville, this is 19 miles to the north, not far away, reported a very unusual experience. It was 10 p.m., July 12, 2004. He was grilling in the backyard, talking to his mom on the phone, when he noticed that he was suddenly enveloped in a beam of light. And as he says, out of the corner of my eyes, at about 300 to 500 feet above me, was an oval-shaped craft with a blue and white colored light fixed on myself. He said this object was gray in color, quite large, 3 to 4 times the apparent size of a full moon. And again, he was talking with his mother on the phone and excitedly started to tell her what he was looking at when this beam immediately retracted and the object darted quickly away. So he went back inside the house only to learn that his wife, who was watching TV, said that during the time of his encounter she noticed that the TV was showing strange flickering interference. This case was investigated by Pete Hardinger, the director of the Roundtown UFO Society, who learned that 5 days after this event, on July 17, a UFO was seen 64 miles to the south in Portsmouth, and it was also sending down beams of light. But events came to a really startling climax on December 21st, 2004, when 2 separate UFO events occurred on the same evening. I'll talk about the first one, which occurred in Strongsville, 175 miles north of Chillicothe. Just a few days earlier, the witness, known only as Diane, was sitting at her computer when, as she says, and I quote, I heard a static kind of sound and turned around to see a round ball. It was about the size of a grapefruit or a small melon that looked like the sun, yellow and orangey bright, about 10 inches above the floor. It moved along the wall across from me in a straight line, doubled back to the middle of the wall, then disappeared. And that night, I had such strange things happen in my sleep. They are bizarre, but I can't get them out of my mind. I'm a nervous wreck. I feel angry, cranky, and scared, and very concerned. So much that I have had bumps on my back for about a week now. She did notice a couple of other things. Her gold ring had a mysterious break in it, and her bracelet had been crushed at the clasp. But it was a few days later, again on December 21st, 2004, and she was leaving the post office when she saw a, quote, light in the sky, which she could not explain, and she believes it was a UFO. Now alone, these cases are interesting enough, but when you add this next and final report, also on December 21st, 2004, things become truly bizarre. Again, as investigated by Pete Hardinger of the Roundtown UFO Society, it was around 8 p.m. as a 43-year-old man and his nephew and their dog were walking outside his home in Chillicothe when they saw a, quote, bright light up in the sky. They said it was following the hill behind their house, and then it stopped and began to hover over a field near a hill. At this point, their dog ran away in fear, but they were curious, so they decided to walk to the area. Now it was night, 8 p.m., so they carried flashlights to navigate through the trees to the field. And as the main witness says, when we got to the field, we saw that the light was above the tree line on the other side and was fairly large. We signaled the light with our flashlights, and to our amazement, the light reacted by flashing, then changing shapes into a pyramid, a star, a square, as if it was some kind of laser light show. Then it returned to its circular shape and began to glow in a purple light, and the whole field was glowing purple also. Now, events quickly escalated to a whole new level, because as the witness says, we noticed what appeared to be some kind of entities coming out of the top of the globe, and they were gesturing at us with their arms. Then one came out of the globe completely and floated down until it stood in front of us. It was shaped like a human, but was made completely of the purple light, like a hologram, and had no facial features, fingers on its hands, and it wore a long robe. We tried to communicate with it to no avail, so I reached out my hand in a friendly gesture, and the being reached out its hand and put it in mine. I felt no pressure on my hand, no feeling of a presence at all. We then noticed these 4 red blinking lights appear around the field, surrounding the field on each side. One moved to the large purple globe, then back to its position. Now it was at this point that something even weirder happened. The father apparently blacked out for a second and does not recall what happened, but the nephew does. He saw the glowing purple being float back up and re-enter into the globe. But as his uncle, the main witness, says, apparently I had a memory lapse once I touched the creature's hand. I do not remember this happening. I had glanced up to see these lights, and when I looked back at the being in front of me, it was gone. Once the being of purple light was gone, we now began to get very cold and got a strange feeling of paranoia, like there was something else in the field with us that we could not see. So we went home rather quickly at this point. We found our dog hiding in the woods. How amazing is that? I think probably these various events are connected to some extent. Obviously, really hard to say for sure, it's pure speculation, but given that they occurred in the same area around the same time, that's pretty interesting. I love all the evidence surrounding this case. In that last case with the animal reaction as well, it's important because this shows once again that it's not just us being affected by these encounters, but animals as well. In fact, the witness in that case only came forward because he wanted answers. He wanted to know if any other people had seen light beings like the one he saw. And there are other cases very much like it. So the answer is yes. All right, now let's move to the last and final case in this compilation. This one is a doozy. It's quite unusual. I call this one the giant alien. And I like this one because it is a multiple witness case. Some really unique and unusual elements to it that I don't think I've heard before. Frankly, I don't think I've ever heard a description of an ET quite this large, but they verified it. So I have to think that, they're good observers in this case, which occurred fairly recently, August 21st, 2014, in Talavera de la Reina. This is in Toledo, Spain. And yeah, this is a really unusual encounter, to say the least. This case comes from researcher Albert Rosales, who talked directly to the witnesses and published this account in his 2010-2015 volume of Humanoid Encounters, The Others Amongst Us. It involves 3 witnesses, all friends. The primary witness is known only by his initials, LF. It was late in the night of August 21st, 2014, and they had gone to a field near a local extension bridge, probably the one pictured here, as there are no other extension bridges in this area of Talavera de la Reina, Toledo, Spain. And they were planning to do a meditation exercise, and had meditated silently for some time when suddenly a large glowing orb, 1/3 the apparent size of the moon, descended down from the sky and hovered directly above them. Now at first LF paid no attention to this object, but then he was suddenly struck by a powerful, quote, electric current. So he could physically feel this thing. And after about 1 minute, a smaller sphere came out of the larger one, and the larger one disappeared. So curious, the 3 friends examined the area and began to walk through the field to look for what was going on here, and had walked for about a half mile, at which point they could smell a very strong kind of odor of sulfur. They also noticed the temperature in the area rose noticeably. Now LF became even more intrigued and ran ahead of his friends to reach the end of this wall that they were standing nearby, and as he did so, his friends began to yell excitedly at him to stop, stop, please come back, come back. So LF immediately stopped. He turned around to look at his friends, who were now about 300 feet away from him, and his friends shouted out that they had seen this strange figure, huge. They weren't sure how big he was, but somewhere between 9 and 12 feet tall, and he was standing on the other side of this wall, but moving at very high speed, seeming to glide above the ground and heading directly towards their friend. And that's when they screamed, at which point this figure quickly hid behind a tree on the other side of the wall, which was only about 15 feet away from LF. So hearing this, LF turns around to look, and to his shock, he can see this figure. And he agreed that it was exceedingly tall, very broad shoulders, a dark body, but really the only thing he noticed was its eyes, which seemed to almost shine with this bright golden yellow light. So the witness stared in absolute disbelief as this figure stared right back at him, and he became overwhelmed with fear. He felt like this figure might try to reach out and grab him. So he ran in terror, yelling at his friends to do the same, and all 3 took off with the feeling that they were running for their lives. Now, as they ran, they saw that this figure was following them, sliding along the top of the wall, and apparently coming right along with them. So they ran across the field towards the main road, and LF's 2 friends said, as they were running away, they felt this weird feeling as if their legs were becoming numb and they were being pricked by needles, which interfered with their ability to get away from this area. Now LF did not notice any strange sensations, but again he was slightly separated from them. Now, however, as they ran away from this chasing figure and were coming up to the safety of the main road, all 3 men became, they said, enveloped in this strange, almost spiderwebby-like substance, which made it very difficult for them to see anything in front of them. So they had with some effort, free themselves from this weird substance, which they did, and they reached the main road, at which point they turned around and this figure was now gone. They were all too shook up to investigate further, and they quickly returned home. But the next day, still curious, LF did return to the site. He examined the tree where this creature had briefly hidden behind so he could try to gauge its size. And to his amazement, this tree was a bit taller than he thought, about 24 feet high. So when he saw this creature, he said it was nearly as tall as this tree itself, which would make its size considerably in excess of 12 feet. But hard to say because again it was at night and they were quite frightened. He did continue to search around this area and found an area of flattened and scorched grass. As far as the webby substance that they all felt, He didn't see any remains of it, but he is sure it wasn't spider webs, as the trees in the area were quite dry with little vegetation. This was an area he had been in many times before, and he had never seen either spiders or webs before. So that remains a mystery. That's another case that I think is hard to dismiss, given that there are 3 witnesses, given that there's apparent landing traces. It's a really interesting case, and I'm a little bit sad that the witnesses did experience such intense fear, because I often wonder what would happen if someone did not experience fear and flee the scene. You might have a much more extensive encounter, and we might have learned quite a bit more about what's going on here. Certainly we do have a lot of cases where that has happened, and often people are taken on board, and they have an encounter which they learn a lot, and perhaps even get healed, or learn all kinds of information. So yeah, this does happen. But so many humanoid encounters. I've presented 10 here, again, all the way from the 1940s up to quite recently, the 2010s, all over the world. Impossible to deny that something is going on here. And it's such a shame that our own governments, while they'll talk about drones, while they'll talk about UFOs and sightings, they're not talking about humanoids. And that is very telling. I think that's a very important detail that we really need to recognize. This cover-up is still in place. We're still dealing with a lot of machinations, I guess, is one way of putting it. There's a cover-up. It's still in place. But I think now we're definitely turning the tide. This subject is growing in popularity by leaps and bounds. There's a lot of people talking about it. It's moving mainstream. So we're absolutely making progress. But until I see that Roswell craft in a museum, until I can see the ET bodies, until we have full truth and transparency with this subject, I'm going to continue doing this research and putting out these episodes because I think it's an important subject that has the potential to change the world for the better in many different ways. So thanks very much for watching, guys. I truly appreciate it. It's because of you I'm doing this research and putting out these episodes. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next week, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking those hard questions. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you later. Bye for now.